War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 3, the Clausewitz Glossary. Since writing was created, people have written about war. And before then, the tales were audibly shared, generation to generation, to not only remember heroic deeds, but to also capture the key lessons, so that when the next generation inevitably went to war, they would do so armed with the most important weapon of all, experience. In the 4,000 plus years of writing about wars, two names have emerged preeminent, Sun Tzu and Karl von Clausewitz, and for good reason. I start with Clausewitz today not because he is necessarily better, but rather because, unlike Sun Tzu, he introduced some terms which rebuilt the Western doctrine of war. I will freely admit, Sun Tzu is the easier, more fun, and initially far more nuanced read. If you were to read one book on war, I would recommend Sun Tzu. Side note, there is a great debate whether Sun Tzu was even a person. I fall on the side saying he was not, but rather a fictional, perfected persona that others used as a humble means to forward their ideas, to perhaps escape criticism from their own personal failures in war. I intend to delve deeper into Sun Tzu and Clausewitz in later episodes as I dedicate episodes to famous theorists in history. But for today, we must talk about a few of the doctrinal words and phrases Clausewitz brought to military theory before we can continue our journey. While some theorists have written volume after volume of histories and theories, looking at you, JFC Fuller, both Sun Tzu and Clausewitz have one full book each. And while Clausewitz's book, Vom Krieg, literally on war, is usually found in a single volume, it is comprised of several shorter books, 8 to be exact. This is not the full scope of his writing, but it does comprise what is known by 99% who read Clausewitz. Entire academic careers have revolved around studying his theories. No 20th century theorist worth their overexalted title could start a book without saying how Clausewitz was wrong and finding an aspect to attack. But they could not ignore him. And in attacking him, they invariably accepted so much of what he wrote about, if not necessarily invented personally. Clausewitz was unquestionably a product of his age. He bore the significant mental scars of having been part of the Prussian army that went toe-to-toe with Napoleon, and usually lost. He was a prisoner of war, fought in several campaigns as a senior staff officer, back in the day when senior staff actually fought, or at least was physically present at major battles. And, most importantly for our purposes here, served as the director of the German War College, from which the U.S. developed our series of formal military schools from which I graduated. Here he served for 15 years, from immediately after Waterloo in 1815, where he fought, or at least was present, until he was called up in 1830 to help contain a cholera outbreak on the Polish border. He and a hero of Waterloo, Gneisenau, both succumbed to the disease in 1831. He was 51 years old. He started work on Vom Krieg in 1816, and at his death considered only the first chapter of the first book complete. But what a chapter it was. If Sun Tzu is the one book to read, then the first chapter of the first book of Vom Krieg is the single most important piece of work ever written on war. Brilliant insight after brilliant insight is explained in simple yet profound words. It's enough to make you want to learn German just to read it in the original. Another side note, I didn't. While the wars of the 19th century post-Napoleon were focused on the Swiss theorist Jomini, a solid theorist, admittedly, and one worth dedicating an episode to later, the 20th century was shaped, rightfully, by Clausewitz. His wife, in absolute badass mode, took just his notes after his death and compiled the entire rest of the 8 books into what is a must-read for any officer responsible for planning and conducting war. A few pitfalls to Clausewitz one must consider. He wrote in the dialectic, in the first chapter, meaning he tore down war to its theoretic basics, bypassing many of the real-world considerations. As this chapter is so good and hits so many key points, Many officers, and probably theorists, never really progress past it, which then leads them to criticize Clausewitz as failing to acknowledge limited wars. Spoiler, he very well understood limited wars of limited objectives. Failing to accept non-nation state conflicts. His principles apply regardless of the Westphalian status of the combatants, and a myriad of other logical fallacies meant to minimize his impact. For the last 10 years of my career, I made it a point to reread the entirety of Clausewitz, and every time, as I delved into the chapters he himself called incomplete, I found these criticisms ignorant, if not flat out wrong. So ignore the haters. Clausewitz is the GOAT. If you have made it this far on my man-crushing on the Prussian, thank you. So let's get to the point already. Critical Clausewitzian Concept 1, the center of gravity. This episode was initially going to be nothing but the concept of center of gravity, or cog. It's that important. But that would have been a long episode and more than what we needed moving forward. And there is just too much damn good stuff in Clausewitz to stop there. Maybe later we can go in more depth. The cog is simply the single point that, if removed from the enemy or destroyed, restricts or preferably stops his ability to continue fighting. Because of that, your efforts must focus on targeting and destroying the enemy's cog while protecting your own. Every level of war will have its own cog. That's why we did levels of war before Clausewitz. But each level of war will only have one. Many will argue, and have, that there can be multiple cogs at the same level. But if that is true, then it serves no purpose, because you can't mass, a term we will define better next episode, your combat power against multiple cogs. If you can't determine what the single cog for the enemy is, then suck less, do better. The cog can be physical, psychological, technical, anything which exists for the enemy. By definition, at the policy or grand strategy level, it may be political. Cogs can and will change, especially at the tactical level. It can change in the middle of a battle. They will change as a campaign or war continues. The U.S. Army, having lost to illiterate goat herders in a 20-year war, focuses on the physical cog at the tactical level, rendering psychological considerations at the most primal point of combat somehow irrelevant. This is wrong. It is precisely at the tactical level where the psychological rules supreme over the physical. The Israeli Defense Forces imperfectly tried to incorporate this concept with their effects-based operations fighting concepts in the early 2000s. But admittedly, demanding your battalion commanders be both technical experts in ground maneuver fighting, as well as psychologists and able to penetrate the ideas of the French postmodernists, may be asking a bit too much. So cog, find the enemy's cog, take your power and destroy it, and always protect your own. Critical Clausewitzian Concept number 2, the Paradoxical Trilogy. He called it fascinating. Whatever. All war, at every level, consists of 3 effectively mutually exclusive inputs that compete and invariably destroy any attempt to render warfare a science. The first is the raw, primal, violent aspect of mortal combat: rage, passion, enmity. This exists at the political level, as the population is enraged to the point of wanting to destroy their own peaceful existence simply to destroy another's. You then have the hard, cold reasoning of why you are conducting a specific act, the realpolitik of tangible gains to be realized by the application of force, the scientific realm of war. And then the third leg of this most wobbly stool, pure, random chance. Shit happens in war. Things that can transcend and upset both the fury of fighting and the pure rational calculation of gain. Anyone who has competed at any level, but most especially armed conflict, can tell you random acts of both good and bad luck can bring victory or defeat in an instant. And the combatant must maintain the nimbleness of mind to recognize when luck, good or bad, has intervened in your fight and adjust accordingly and instantly, or you will fail. Many have tried to unify the trinity and make it a tool to develop strategy. You cannot. That is a fool's errand. Clausewitz explained that the existence of the trinity makes war a fluid, constantly changing, unpredictable folly. Its existence can only be acknowledged and accepted. You cannot plan your way out of it entirely. You take advantage of what you can when it favors you and weather out its outrageous fortune when it favors your foe. You accept the passions that render war absolutely illogical, and likewise never embark upon conflict in the absence of a completely rational, beneficial, and achievable end state. Fascinating and paradoxical indeed. Critical Clausewitzian concept number 3, the fog of war. Having fought in the era of black powder, whose every shot erupted in showers of flame and plumes of white smoke, this is both literal and figurative for Clausewitz. Simply that critical aspects of the battle and battlefield, your forces, your enemy's forces, the terrain will be hidden from literal or figurative view. There will be things that you should know, must know, for success that you will not know. And often, if you do find out, it won't be until it's too late. This goes back to the third leg of the paradoxical trinity. Every attempt must be made to penetrate the fog and glean what you can. But never forget the unknown lurks, ready to upset your best laid plans. So prepare for it as best you can by developing different courses of action, and be prepared to change your plan if the fog should so fortunately lift for you, and do everything you can to ensure the fog blows in your enemy's direction. Critical Clausewitzian concept number 4, friction. The more parts a machine has, the more these parts will interact and grind against each other. And even with the best lubrication and finest tolerancing, the friction of these parts will wear down that machine and keep it from operating at the optimal level. So too, and even more so, with an army. As Clausewitz wrote, "So in war, through the influence of an infinity of petty circumstances, which cannot properly be described on paper, things disappoint us, and we fall short of the mark. A powerful iron will overcomes this friction. It crushes the obstacles, but certainly the machine along with them. A simple order can be misinterpreted, certainly in the heat of battle and competing with the din of clashing swords or chattering PKMs. What is easy on paper or in training becomes incredibly difficult. The rational order falling prey to the fury and emotion of the moment of battle. The fog of the unknown, the irrationality of killing and being killed, the thunderbolts of bad luck or unpredicted actions from a capable foe, and take the theoretical perfect plan and render it a gobbled mess. Good training, fine equipment, intelligent officers, and strong men can all help lubricate this terrible machine of war making, but friction will always be there. Every one of these concepts could be their own episode, and maybe they will be in the future if you guys want to. Let me know which of these 4 you found the most interesting, or maybe the most confusing. There is more, so much more, that Clausewitz introduced that we could talk about. But this is enough to get us started and allow us to move on to next week's subject, the principles of war. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.